Hi, I'm Phil Ball, pastor of Odyssey Christian Church in Jenks, Oklahoma. We're part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we offer a non-judgmental approach to support your personal journey of faith. After the message, we invite you to keep listening for a presentation from our wonderful band. And if you want to experience worship live, we invite you to find out all the details at www.facebook.com/Odyssey CC.
His dad's 93, and it wasn't his hip. It was his leg, real close to his hip. And so they were going to put him in Fort Hills, and then, as some of us are familiar with, the insurance company said, "Oh, not so fast there," and he's got to go to someplace else. And so Stoners moved him all around, and so he needed to be out tonight in that process of caring for his dad. But everybody else is here. Cool. What a party. And so we're rolling down the road. Well, we're working on the Lord's Prayer. Hi, Steph. And who knows, Claudine may roll in anytime now. But I love it. So we've been working on the Lord's Prayer. We're keep moving through this. And, you know, there's a way you can kind of look at this and go, how ploddy is this? But it's just this magnificent piece of literature that is just so faith-driven. It's so fundamentally important. But let me just kind of rehearse a minute. We started off then, pray then in this way, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And hallowed be your name is our new part today. But as we experienced last week, our is the operative word, which includes everybody. It's not my or all folks of a certain gender, age, race, ethnical origin, sexual orientation, economic strata, or mental ability. It's our Father. And Father really is not like a formal father. It's like Abba or Daddy or Papa, an intimate address, who is by the order, he is the head of the household of heaven. Daddy is not just a gender-specific term as much as it represents a whole leader of the household, which could be male, female. All of us, like everybody in a good marriage knows that the wife really runs everything anyhow, so you just have to acknowledge that and go with it. And so that it's not a gender-specific, but the King of Heaven was really described by Jesus and most clearly of what that nature of that kingdom was in the 5th chapter of Matthew, who raised the bar for all kinds of spiritual and moral development. They're really at God's level. And John Crossan called our Papa the divine householder, who sets up his house rules for the kingdom that includes everybody. And so when we pray the address, the all-inclusive Papa who has established a divine kingdom of justice and inclusive love for all people, that's how it starts, but then it goes a little further. And so what I ask is, what's in a name? I don't know, some of you may, I don't need you could talk about it when we do the 6 questions maybe. I haven't figured that one out yet. I'm waiting on the angels to talk. But you may have gotten your first name for a purpose one way or another. My brother told me, because my mother was nonverbal, mostly, my brother told me that he thought that I got my name not because Phil means a lover of horses, but because my mom, when she ironed, because I can remember this, she listened to radio soap operas because we didn't have television. And that one of the characters she was in love with was named Phil. Now, that's what my brother told me. Now, whether or not, she never fessed up to me about it, but, you know, everybody's got kind of a thing about that, and you can know what I'm talking about. But I would say to you that people of faith have struggled with the name of God for centuries because there's so many crazy names that are all attached to God's presence. And we're going to play with that just a little bit tonight in a way that I think is helpful. So that when we talk about hallowed be your name, it's important for us to kind of have a grip of 2 things, of hallowed and holy and what that's about, but also the essence of a name. Those are important pieces that we need to recognize, and that knowing that God's essence or name is holy. Okay, so I hope that in your life you've captured the idea that you may actually define your name by your personal character or whatever. A lot of times that's done with people's last names. You know, we Nelsons always are on the sea, you know, or some kind of thing like that if you're British. It's the last name defines you, and you have to stand up for the last name and that kind of a thing. Because I know that Lawton, where I grew up, was small enough that I was one of the ball boys. I remember a time that my neighbor across the street, Sergeant Cyril, who was, no, that was Sergeant McClure. Sergeant McClure wanted to go frog gigging. And he didn't have a place to go frog gigging, except he knew that my dad knew everybody in about a 6 square mile area east of Lawton. And so he wanted me to take him frog gigging. And so as a highfalutin 9th grader, I would go and say, my name is Phil Ball, and I'm T.H. Ball's son. Could we stab frogs in your pond? And they were fine with that. They as long as you don't shoot anything, don't shoot him. Like, well, we're just stabbing frogs. And you get out there in the dark and, you stab these frogs and stuff like that. Well, that was because of my last name, It's like they kind of had a sense of who that was. And so there's this last name piece. Well, here's the thing. God is the one who defines God's self and God's name and what that names mean. Rather than a name defining God, we must first consider that God defined God's own essence by revealing the divine name. And I think that's just a flip that's different, that God is the one who defines what my name means. It's not just what you call me or what you identify with me by having a name, like number 6023555. It's not an identity issue in terms of can we find you for your credit card bill. It's an essence, a being, an ontology that God defines on self. So that God's nature, God's character, God's values are all symbolized or dramatized by the name. And so God defines God's own name. And so in order to begin to understand that, we got to hear a story. Okay, we got to hear a Bible story. Because this is the first time in the biblical record, if you would, or the biblical experience where there's a name issue. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, which is also called Sinai, and whoever walked around it may have called it something else. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, and yet it was not consumed. And then Moses said, dude, I've never seen anything like this. No, he said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why this bush is not burned up. He has just encountered the divine nature, best described as a holy mystery. It's that burning but not being burned up thing that goes on. It's that which extends beyond what we know, the way things are, and that pushes the boundaries of reality and causes us to think new thoughts. Our current cultural tendency is to first try to explain everything we don't understand. I've had a picture of Moses pulling out his smartphone, taking a picture of it, texting it to YouTube. It goes to YouTube and gets all over the world, and a team of scientists arrive to examine the bush, because we got to figure out what's this about. But that's not the story. The story is Moses is standing in front of this burning bush. And I'm just reading this story to you now. When the Lord saw that Moses, had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush. Now I got to stop. I got to make a little editorial remark. I think there are people that that if they encountered a burning bush, they'd go, dude, and they would walk on. They would stay away because they did not turn and stop and see. And that denotes a certain characteristic on Moses' part. And I'm hoping that one of the things you take away tonight is that whenever you got burning bushes going on, the mystery of God somehow throw it in front of you. I mean, I'm not against you taking a video of it and putting it on YouTube. That's cool. But I want you to understand that if you stop and look at it, it may be an encounter that moves you into a new place, just like it did Moses. You may not want to go there, but let's listen to the story. Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. It's a burning talking bush. Then God said, come no closer, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now that's a signal. So we have a mysterious encounter. We turn aside to see, we hear a voice, and we recognize that we stand on holy ground. Now I want you to pay real close attention to these next characteristics in the story of God's character, of who God is, what God values, what God's passions are, what God's concerned are. The first characteristic symbolized by God's name is God's history with Moses and the Hebrews and the relationships that are all grounded in the past. Because the very next verse says this. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham and Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The first characteristic of God's holy name is that God has been with Moses' ancestors from the earliest days. He says, basically, I have history with your people. I knew your great times 200 grandfather. Okay, there's this historical piece. The second characteristic of God's name is a fundamental concern for all of us in our collective welfare, and this is verse 7. It's the very next verse. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know of their sufferings. So that second characteristic is God showing God's concern for people in the present moment. And it's, as I was early in the church in my life in the late 60s, I started working at church in North Oklahoma City in 1964. And one of the things that I heard adults in that church say is, the church shouldn't be messing in politics. They had never read Exodus because God is concerned about his people in the middle of a political situation in Egypt. And that's the second characteristic of who God is and God's essence. The third characteristic of God's name is that God is involved, observing, listening, and connecting to God's people. Verse 8 reads, And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of what I call the many ites. Okay? Everybody's with that one? Anybody can remember an ite? Canaanite, Perizzites? Yeah. Those ites, termites, all the ites, they're all in there. And it's that land, it's that place. They're all there. Jebusites, Dolomites, which I think are really islands. And we can learn much about God from listening to burning bushes. And I'll tell you a quick story. If you're watching a CBS morning show this morning, there was a segment on a guy named Hugh Evans. And he is the chairman of the Global Citizen Music Festival. And this is a big festival they're doing, Hugh Jackman, Carrie Underwood, and a bunch of stuff to try to raise money for hunger across the world. And it's a really cool organization because I kind of looked into it. Well, his story that he told was, and he's a young man. He's not an older man at all. And he's probably in his late 20s, thereabouts. He's really amazing. And he said, I took a trip with an organization called World Vision International when I was 14 years old. And he said, I went to the Philippines, and we were in Manila. And our assignment that all of us had to do was to spend the night with a person of our age. And they assigned me to a young man who was exactly 14, and I had to spend the night with him wherever he was. And we slept in the city dump. And all around me were cockroaches and smelly things and all kinds of yucky stuff. And he said, I was laying there thinking about that, and I realized that it was just the chance of birth that I was here and he was there. And I decided at that time, when I was 14, to commit my life to helping combat world hunger. And that was his burning bush. It was a smelly dump in the middle of Manila in the Philippines when he was 14 years old. And he responded to it. And that's how God's sacred name works. Because the name is not, like I said, an identity issue. It is the essence of being. It is the essence of character and nature and what God is like. Another characteristic of God's name and the holiness is the way God involves we humans as integral components in the redeeming acts. And I like preachers who say, don't you remember when, assuming people actually read the text, but I will tell you that in Genesis 2, the second creation story, there's a thing goes on. God creates the first earth creature. And there's no gender in the Hebrew at this point. And Adam is really a name for earth creature in Hebrew. It's not a formal name. And the earth creature is created, and then God builds a garden for the earth creature, and then God says, it is not good that the earth creature, and you can call him Pat or Dusty or whatever you need to do as a good name. The earth creature should be alone. He needs a partner. And so God goes about creating all these animals. And the act of creation that God continually does is to bring the animals or whatever he was creating to the earth creature and say, you name them. I make them, you name them. It's a deal. It's a cooperative effort. And that's what I consistently see in the text. God is always doing things together. And so then God says, so come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. That is so great. How much fun is that? Not. Because everybody knows the story of Moses, right? He was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter and the whole business, and creates a problem, and his wanted man, his picture was pasted on desert rocks. They painted it on there and said, get this man, Moses, and he's fled all the way to Midian, and he's hooked up with a prince of Midian and married his daughter and all that business, and he's like the last place he wants to go is back to Egypt. That's the second stupidest thing anybody's ever had. And that's another characteristic of the divine name. God's name is always doing that stuff to us. And Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. And this shall be the sign that I'll get you, who have sent you. After you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship me on this mountain. Isn't that easy? I always thought, give me a break. There's got to be more than this. But then Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, to the God of your ancestors, the past, has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord God, the God of your ancestor of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Our daddy, the householder of heaven, hallowed be your name. Just as there is a visual paradox in the encounter of the bush that's on fire and not being burned up, so the fundamental name, I am who I am, is a verbal paradox that we know is filled with mystery. Basically, God is saying, Moses, I am the unnameable one. God is fundamentally beyond being named, and yet we must always try to find a name as we encounter the complexities of God. The best clue I can kind of play with that is that the North American, Native American Indians have some mythology that goes around shape shifters, that there will be an entity within their tribe or an individual who can literally change who they are. If you saw like Star Trek 6, there was a shape shifter in that one. Kind of cute sometimes, but that's God just kind of changes form. I mean, God talks through burning bushes and shows up and talks in donkeys and other kinds of places, as you go through there. So it's like this entity is unnameable because it always just shows up. God's holy divine nature as we move through the variety of our lives and experiences. God is a mystery we need to wrestle with, just like Jacob did before he met Esau. But winning the match is not the issue. We learn and grow in understanding our personal holiness in the wrestling with God itself. I'm here to tell you that I know so many people who have struggled in their lives with issues that just derail them. A lot of times it's through their children, that just blow them sideways, and they struggle with it, and they're pushed emotionally. It could be a physical illness. It could be 100 other things. It could be economic collapse on your finances or a ton of other things that push you, personal relationships. And I have experienced, if they allow it, it moves them closer to God's Spirit as they wrestle with that, just like it did for Jacob in meeting Esau. In that interaction from Genesis 32, it says, "Then the man said," that was the angel, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and prevailed." It's like what the poetry is trying to say is in that wrestling with the nature of God, our names are changed. We have a new identity. We become something more than what we were. I mean, I just know person after person who has just had, and it can go the other way too, had either transformative or it can be really hard on you. You can, try to self-soothe with all kinds of outside influences that are not always helpful. So our wrestling with the holy presence of God in our lives, we gain a new identity and a name whereby we are known. God is the fire that will not go out or consume the bush. God is the sacred ground upon which we must stand with our sandals in our hands. God is the one who causes us to wrestle all night and strive, gaining a new name in the process. Our Papa, leader of heaven, hallowed be your essence. The secondary name God gives to Moses is more of an indirect, operational, functional name. Basically, God says, I'm the God of the past, the present, and the future. The God of your ancestors in the past, the deliverer of God's people from their current bondage and misery and suffering, and the one who leads them into a new future in the promised land. And I want you to hold on to that whenever you go through difficult times. God has known you from the past. God cares about your certain situation, and God will go with you as you move into your futures. That's because the essence of the name. And when we say, your name be held holy, that's what we're holding on to. That's what we're encompassing is this massive care. God is the daddy of heaven. We don't always understand or even have a clue about what God is doing when God is caring for us, just like our parents. I mean, I've got stories even about that I'm not going to spend the time with you, but even as youth pastor, there's been some times that I would make a housing assignment and upset one young lady and her parents in order for a whole nother woman to even be able to have the possibility to go. And, you just go, dude, it's okay. Be mad at me. It's just one of those things. God always works to care for us, and we may not understand the process. So our job is to stay by the bush on holy ground with sandals in hand, listening. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your being, your character, your way. Maybe that looks a little like this. fourscore years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. Or maybe it looks like this. On Sunday, March the 7th, 1965, 600 nonviolent protesters, many of them young, gathered at the foot of Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge to begin a 50-mile march to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery to protest against an ongoing exclusion of African Americans from the electoral process. When they reached the other side of the bridge, the marchers were brutalized by state and local police, mounted and on foot, with billy clubs and tear gas. This atrocity, witnessed on television by millions of Americans, scandalized the nation. It also generated enough political momentum in Congress that President Lyndon Johnson was able to sign a Voting Rights Act into law 5 months after the march. In 1965, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was led by John Lewis, then 25 years old, in the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As the leader, he was the first to be beaten by the police, who fractured his skull, left marks he bears to this day, 48 years later. 25-year-old John Lewis and his age mates in the civil rights movement were the descendants of the generations of people who had suffered the worst America had to offer, but had not given up on the vision of freedom, justice, and equity that represents this country at its best. Those people nurtured that vision in their children and their grandchildren at home. I am the God of your ancestors. In the neighborhood, in the classrooms, and especially in the churches, creating a steady, multi-generational stream of underground activity that was largely invisible to white Americans until it rose up to claim our attention in the 50s and the 60s. I care about the suffering of my people. Parker Palmer is telling this story by happenstance. He was just sitting behind John Lewis on a bus as they commemorated this event. And one of his staff members were sitting behind him, and Parker Palmer overheard the rest of another story. Lewis is telling this story to his staffer. In 1961, me and a friend were at a bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina, when several young white men attacked and beat me bloody with baseball bats. Lewis and his friend did not fight back. They declined to press charges. They simply treated their wounds and went on with their civil rights work. In 2009, 48 years after this event, a white man about John Lewis's age walked into John Lewis's office on Capitol Hill accompanied by his middle-aged son. And he said, "Mr. Lewis, my name is Elwyn Wilson. I'm one of the men who beat you in that bus station back in 1961. I want to atone for the terrible thing I did, so I've come to seek your forgiveness. Will you forgive me?" Lewis said, "I forgave him." We embraced. He and his son and I wept, and then we talked. As Lewis came to the end of his remarkable and moving story, he leaned back into the seat on the bus. He gazed out the window for a while as we passed through the countryside that was once a killing ground for the Ku Klux Klan, in which Elwyn Wilson had been a member. Then, in a very soft voice, as if speaking to himself about the story he had just told and all of the memories that had been moving in him, Lewis said, "People can change. People can change." And at that moment, I, Parker Palmer, felt as if I had seen deep into the soul of a true healer of the heart of democracy. I saw the faith in our shared humanity that has kept John Lewis on the march for all these years, despite the abundant evidence that we are capable of being unloving, untruthful, and unjust. Our Papa Daddy in heaven, holy is your very being in all of creation. If you would join with me. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. Let us pray. Dear God, in that ritual prayer we offer up, we hold your essence. We point at your essence. We experience your being. We pray that you will continually use us, move in us, enable us to be those ones who are your people. And we give you thanks. Amen.